that the case for markets revolved around relatively dry but nevertheless important concepts such as efficiency and productivity. And then, as a sixth form girl in a forgotten cotton mill town in the north of England, I read Milton Friedman. I'd not long begun my studies of economics at the tender age of 16 at Oldham Sixth Form College when I came across Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom on the shining shelves of what was a newly built library. I remember the cover, which was golden yellow, as well as the way that I'd be tongue-twisted saying out loud that I'm reading Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. Whilst I was yet to be exposed to Keynesian thinking, which most certainly happened when I entered university in Cambridge, Friedman's message has stayed with me and is one to which I found myself returning in my recent years of feminist activism. It's a message that speaks to the social, not just economic aspects of the market. Friedman understands the realities of human life, that life involves real people, each of whom is different, and each of whom lives in communities where they don't necessarily get on with one another. So today, I want to outline Friedman's social, as opposed to economic defense of the market, placing his work in the context not only of previous defenders of the market, but also of the rapid social change that was taking place at the time Friedman put pen to paper. I'll go on to outline why Friedman's message is just as important today as it was back in the 1960s, taking the example of modern-day women's rights and the feminist movement. I'll conclude with some recommendations as to how we can better make the case for markets at a time when they seem to be under attack. Now, for those on the left, the communal state of nature is a reasonably happy and harmonious one. It is, we are told, only capitalist exploitation that causes us to be at each other's throats. Gender and racial inequalities are reduced down to economic inequalities. Eliminate class, and you will eliminate all other problems. Now, if only it was that easy. To my mind, the natural state of society is not one in which we live happily side by side in general agreement, taking care of one another and being tolerant of individual differences. Society and the individual often face an inherent conflict. I saw this when I was a young girl in the playground of my school, and I see it today in the world that is Twitter. Now, this inherent conflict is one in which the majority want to single out and stamp on the minority, and the cost is great, our own sense of self, one that we must keep in the closet so as to conform with the majority. Now, it's perhaps unsurprising, though rarely pointed out, that the economists best known for making the case for the market often themselves experienced the wrath of society. Now, Adam Smith is known for being something of a social outsider. He certainly wasn't a natural social animal. David Ricardo became estranged from his Jewish family after marrying a Quaker. And as a non-conformist Christian, John Stuart Mill found it difficult to place himself within the esteemed scholarly ranks of Oxford and Cambridge. Mill also saw life from the point of view of his co-writer and later wife, Harriet Taylor, who as a woman was excluded from the political sphere and deemed unequal to men by the society around her. Milton Friedman, along with Ayn Rand, came from immigrant, poor Jewish families, meaning that both were well aware of the way in which society in Europe had demonized the Jewish minority population with disastrous consequences. So to such thinkers, it couldn't have been more apparent that society doesn't always support our individual freedom. It can jeopardize it, and with it, our ability to, quite simply, be ourselves. So the state isn't the only target of free market thinkers, so is society. And I think that comes across nicely in this quote from John Stuart Mill from 1859. Society can and does execute its own mandates, and if it issues wrong mandates instead of right, or any mandates at all in things with which it ought not to meddle, it practices a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression, since, though not usually upheld by such extreme penalties, it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. As Friedman highlighted in Capitalism and Freedom, the market helps us to resolve that tension between society and the individual by allowing us to live side by side with one another in a way that is much less tyrannical than is the natural state of the world or any commune. In order that we're fed, watered and sheltered, we don't have to conform with the majority. We can instead live our own individual lifestyles, whilst the market helps to anonymously coordinate our individual choices. In the commune, by contrast, you can be deprived of food unless you conform, whereas in the supermarket, the checkout assistant hands over your shopping, even if you have very different political views or morals to their own. Indeed, markets have an incentive to provide for all kinds of different individual lifestyles and tastes. That's the beauty of profit. The commune, by contrast, has no such incentive. So to quote Milton Friedman, a major source of objection to a free economy is precisely that it gives people what they want instead of what a particular group, the majority, thinks they ought to want. Underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. Now, we can also see Friedman's political economy and his case for markets in the historical context of the time when capitalism and freedom was written. So if we think about post-World War II America, it's a time when we're seeing increasing resistance to conscription, increasing resistance to the draft, of course, disregarding the Vietnam War. We're seeing divorce, we're seeing the contraceptive pill, we're seeing abortion, civil rights, and later LGBT rights. And as Jason Hickel and Arsalan Khan have argued in a recent article, the hallmark of the revolution of the 1960s was the defense of individual liberty against the constraints of a mass conformist society. So what we had at the time in this post-World War II period was an increasingly state-led economy, but with an increasingly freedom-hungry and anti-authority society, and this disjoint made for an unstable equilibrium. You can see the skepticism amongst the general public towards government brewing. So here we have the percentage of people who trusted government to do what's right, only some or none of the time, rising from 22% there in 1964 to 66% by 1980. These figures are taken from Kelly's book, Bringing the Market Back In. Now, after social freedom, the next natural step, therefore, was economic freedom. Once we have society pushing for social freedoms, that allows Milton Friedman to come in, making the case that economic freedom can help support those newfound social freedoms. That markets can be seen as socially liberating, which is, of course, precisely why they tend to be resisted by the more traditional elements of society. Now, I'd like to finish by looking at another of my interests alongside economics, and that is feminism, and why Milton Friedman's work is of prime relevance, particularly today. Now, of course, feminist economists come in a range of different flavours, from Marxists like Maria Mies to libertarians, and here I think I would draw on the work of Martha Nussbaum, as well as Feminists for Liberty and Ladies for Liberty organisations such as that in the US. However, feminists have in general been very much associated with the left, with critiques of capitalism. And I want to think, why is this? And the first argument seen as the enemy of women. Now, I see it the other way around. In many poorer parts of the world today, society bears down on women through norms that dictate appropriate behaviour, along with the common way that women are valued, namely for their sexual purity. Restrictions not only on women's clothing, but on their ability to travel and to enter the workplace, along with practices such as genital cutting, virginity testing, of course older practices such as foot binding, all rest on the notion that a woman's value is in her sexual virtue, and that anything that could risk that virtue, a woman travelling alone, a woman wearing revealing clothes, a woman's own sexual desire that must be restricted by female genital mutilation, then all of those things must be reined in. Without it, not only is a woman's own worth devalued, but so is that of her wider family. Women are often complicit themselves in these practices. We see that overwhelmingly when it comes to things like genital cutting, arranged marriage, and ancient practices like foot binding. In part, perhaps, because women fear for a reduction in their own worth if they don't comply with these practices, if they don't see the world and see themselves through the eyes of men. Now, even in the West, some of these deep-seated beliefs can still be found. That's evidenced by the rise of modesty ponchos at US high school proms, handed out to girls that are thought to be dressing too revealingly, along with the rise of the purity movement in the US, one in which young women pride themselves on their sexual virtue. In this context, markets shouldn't be seen as a threat to women. They provide an escape from societies that have very particular views about what women should and should not be doing with their lives and with their bodies. Now, there's a second reason why I think feminists tend to have a natural dislike of the market, not because they perhaps have a more positive view of society relative to the market, but also because of the way in which the market seems to enable the monetization of women's bodies. Our attitudes to buying and selling sex are, I think, central to shaping feminist attitudes towards the market in general. Now, feminists themselves here are leading the way when it comes to restricting women's freedom to monetize their own bodies, to do what they want with their own bodies. We have seen a clampdown on grid girls, on glamour modeling, and then more recently on sex workers. In the US, new legislation has made it illegal to provide sex workers with bank accounts or websites, both of which are vital to their independence. And here in Europe, the Nordic model, an approach to sex work that decriminalises the seller of sex, but whilst criminalising the purchaser, has become increasingly popular. It's an approach, in fact, that receives the backing of the Women's Equality Party and the Fawcett Society, so many of these well-known feminist groups, who argue that the criminalisation of your buyer is not going to have any adverse effect on you, that this is helping women. When sex workers speak out, as they are doing right now in the US and the UK, they are ignored by these feminist groups. Now, why are they ignored? Well, the first reason is the denial of individual agency of women who are not like ourselves. The denial of the idea that a woman might choose to become a sex worker, because you yourself wouldn't make that choice. You cannot understand why another woman might make that choice. And so it's argued that there is no difference between involuntary sex work and voluntary sex work, that no woman should be selling sex, that no woman could possibly want to sell sex. So when sex workers actually stand up and say, yes, I am doing this is my preferred option, I want to be supported as a sex worker rather than have my freedoms undermined, my clients criminalised and so on, my website's taken down, my bank account closed down, they are told, you might say you're a voluntary sex worker, I don't think you are. You have been brainwashed by society, brainwashed to give men exactly what they want. The second argument that's made is even those who do accept that women might make a free choice to become a sex worker, it's argued that they have a negative effect on womankind in general. That they create in men the notion that all women are just sexual beings. And because of that negative effect on all women, the freedom of a few women to be voluntary sex workers should be restricted. Now, you will note that the same argument is not applied to, for example, female cleaners. Do we restrict the freedom of female cleaners in case that adds to this idea that women are the people that should be providing that type of cleaning and care service? So there's quite some inconsistency there. Now, delving deeper, there's a third reason why the choices and the voices of this, what is an important minority group of women, some of the most vulnerable and some of the poorest women in society, why we are ignoring those, I think, is also a subconscious moralism amongst those opposed to sex work. Something which naturally predisposes many feminists to anti-capitalist feelings. For those of us who are more comfortable with the idea of women choosing to do whatever they want with their own bodies and who see little in the way of sin in sex, there's much less reason to be fearful of the market. The way I see modern-day feminism is that you have a group of women who have achieved privileged positions by monetizing their brains, who are now denying other women the ability to monetize their bodies. And this, I think, speaks to a lack of tolerance of individuals who make choices that differ from your own, and a privileged, intellectually elitist view of the world in which you think you know best. For all three of those reasons, I think we need Friedman in modern-day feminism. Now, there's another reason we need Friedman in regard to women's rights, and this strikes at another problem that faces women today, another battle in regard to their bodies. I very much see women's bodies as a battleground we face today, and that is women's reproductive rights, the lack of access to birth control. Now, globally, recent evidence suggests that 44% of global pregnancies are unplanned. More than 200 million women who would like to avoid pregnancy lack any form of access to birth control, according to the UN Family Planning Agency. In the USA, recent policy developments have put at risk the Planned Parenthood funding that supports birth control for around 5 million or more poor American women. And the global gag rule has been implemented by the US that defunds international family planning organisation that serves the world's poorest women if the word abortion is mentioned even once. Now, this isn't only of great relevance for a woman's freedom over her own life, this also plays into issues of poverty, inequality, and climate change. One of the greatest ways that we can solve the problem that this planet faces is by giving women the ability to control their fertility. In fact, birth control ranks in the top 10 ways to fight climate change ahead of wind power and solar power, according to work by climatologists. So, after decades of state expansion, free markets returned to popularity in the latter part of the 20th century. And I think this shift deserves to be seen as something other than purely economic, that it was in part a product of the hard-won social freedoms fought for after World War II, particularly during the 1960s. With the help of Friedman, more people began to see the way in which the market could help to defend those newfound individual freedoms. are the lessons going forward? Well, I think if the market is to regain popularity, we need to embrace social liberalism within market thinking. To win hearts and minds, it takes more than dry economic theory. It takes a focus on the individual and on individual human stories. Of course, people like Marianne Tupy at Cato, Dalibor Rohack at the American Enterprise Institute have powerful stories to tell about life on the other side of the Iron Curtain, but it won't be long before those personal stories are lost in time. The arts world has a power to harness these powerful individual stories, and one of the most persuasive arguments I've ever seen for the market comes in the form of a film, a 2006 film, The Lives of Others, which follows a group of young, budding, arty intellectuals in East Berlin in the early 1980s, and with that we see very much the denial of individual freedom of particularly women behind the Iron Curtain. Markets were helped along not only by economists like Friedman, but also by novels. Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, George Orwell's Animal Farm, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which I believe is one of the most looked at books in the US. In recent years, the left has harnessed the arts world very successfully as a means to demonstrate the downsides of markets, drawing attention through films and visual art to the human cost of recessions, austerity, and poverty. Those who want to continue to make the case for markets need to similarly employ art to demonstrate how the state can trample on individual freedoms and the hypocrisy of elites, including feminist ones, who claim to respect individual freedom, but whilst trampling on the choices of others that are different to their own. And that's why I myself like to marry economics and art. Thank you.